Welcome to Psychology of Pilgrimage. Today, I'm so excited to be joined by Elizabeth Hyman, who is a New York Times best-selling author. Her book is called The Girl Bandits of the Warsaw Ghetto, and I can't wait to talk to you about the research that you've done for the book, uh, what drew you into history to begin with, your own family history that connects you to this book, and also some of the pilgrimagey type of themes that I think are related to the book.
Great. Let's do it.
So yeah, let's do it. So first off, what drew you into your work as a historian and an archivist,
Mhm.
from a scholarly perspective, but also from a personal perspective?
Right. So I grew up in a house surrounded by books. And from an early age, I was always reading like the American Girl books and the Dear America books. So I loved history. I also grew up in a Jewish household. My grandmother fled Poland when she was very young. So I always sort of grew up around those histories. I have no real recollection of having sat down and learned what the Holocaust was. And so, when I was finishing up high school, I knew I wanted to study history. But, even then I was like, I should probably try to find a way to study something else to make that marketable at some point. So I added a journalism major to that in undergrad. Then I finished up and I thought I really don't want to give up history. So I was sort of back to trying to figure out a way to keep doing history, but while still having a career outside of academia. And that's why I ended up applying to the University of Maryland's dual history and library science master's degree program. And up until this point, I had really resisted studying the Holocaust. I was, hanging out with very ancient history. It was fun. I did not want to do Holocaust history, but I kind of knew it would get me eventually. So in my second semester of graduate school, I was like, okay, I give up. I'm a Holocaust historian. Let's do this. Because I wasn't ready yet. I knew it would be very, very difficult emotionally, and I waited until I was ready, I guess. As for the topic of the book, this topic actually came to me when I was taking a course about how to read Jewish women's memoirs, autobiographies, diaries, etc., as primary sources and apply historical methodology to them. And one of the first readings we had in this course was an excerpt from the memoir of a woman named Vladka Mead, in which she described smuggling dynamite into the Warsaw Ghetto. And I had no idea prior to that moment that there were women involved in arming the Warsaw Ghetto in preparation for that uprising. So I was really quite righteously indignant. Like, why have I never heard about this? No one told me. And back then, and actually still today, I have a history blog. And at that point, had a series going where I wrote profile posts about interesting, underknown, exciting, etc., historical women. So I thought to myself, okay, I'm going to write a post about this Vlogka person and put it up when I graduate and defend my thesis and all that fun stuff. That blog post ended up taking me 5 years to write and research, and it became an 11-part series that I ended up posting in 2018, in April, actually, to align with the 75th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And while conducting that research, I learned so much about Vladka Mead and her context and her comrades that I felt like I had barely begun to really look at the story for what it was. And so later that year, I was talking to my mom and I said, I really enjoyed writing that blog post from a historical perspective. But I've only just sort of scratched the surface of the stories there. There's still so much left to write about. Should I write another blog post series? And my mother said, well, maybe that's your book. And I said, oh, how do I publish a book? And here we are.
I'm wondering what it was like for you to be writing about a topic that was nonfiction. And not only was it nonfiction, there is overlap with your own family history.
So, what's interesting is that this is not the topic I researched in graduate school or wrote my master's thesis about. And it was my master's thesis that was actually informed by my grandmother's personal history. I wrote my master's thesis about a Jewish refugee community which formed in Shanghai between 1938 and 1947. And I wrote that because I was studying my grandmother's own immigration journey. She was not in Shanghai, but my research into those immigration pathways drew me to that topic. So actually, my interest in these young Polish Jewish women who were resisting was kind of a deviation from the path I was following in graduate school. So the 5 years I spent researching and writing that post, I refer to that as my self-directed PhD period. Um, so while my grandmother had not been one of those women in my book, it was still meaningful to me as a woman of Polish Jewish descent to see what women my age, at least my age when I first got the idea, I'm older than them now, what women my age were doing in those circumstances. So, these are histories which are not well known and for a wide variety of reasons have not really reached containment from academia. So it was meaningful for me to look at history and see these young, courageous women doing these incredible, incredible deeds and accomplishments.
And in telling the stories of the women, you do so sort of against the backdrop of this historical context, which is also unique for this type of book to have a balance between the personal stories and the historical rigor, which you have synthesized together. And I'm curious a little bit about the writing process,
Mhm.
and how some of the choices you made in terms of how you presented the information and the stories.
Right. So, professionally, I could say I'm a lot of things. I'm an author, I'm an archivist, et cetera, et cetera. But what I usually say is that I'm a public historian. So I have journalism training from undergrad. So, and, from having spent time in academia, there's a real gap between the public, including the educated, intellectually curious public, and what academics know. For a wide variety of systemic reasons, academics can't necessarily focus on writing books accessible for the people. They have to focus on publishing and getting tenure, and there are lots of timelines they have to fulfill. And writing for the public just cannot be prioritized. And that's a real problem because it means that the construction of historical memory is in the hands of people who do not have rigorous academic training in these fields. So the version of history the public is getting is inaccurate and lacking in nuance and context. And that's not necessarily anyone's fault, but it's a problem. And so when I was constructing this narrative, I did work very hard to make it a rigorous work of history. The context of these women and their action is extremely complex. Anything that, where Joseph Stalin is even on the outskirts is extremely complex. Um, and I couldn't just present their stories like, and then they put bombs in their underwear. Like, yes, that happened. But why were they putting bombs in their underwear? How did they get to the point where they're putting bombs in their underwear? How did they become the kind of young women who would volunteer for the type of underground labor which would lead them to putting bombs in their underwear? And as you're a historian, you understand it's all about the questions we ask. So I kept asking those questions. And I think that contextual information is vital to truly understanding who these women are. And in my opinion, the book is very accessible despite its rigor. However, if you look at some of the review pages, which I have done because I'm a very poorly behaved author, my agent yelled at me for doing that. If you look at some of the reviews on Goodreads, you can see that the public is still perhaps not ready for the level of context that historians think should be sort of basic ground level. So, there's still a really huge disconnect about what history is versus what the general reading public expects history to be. I don't mean that in a snotty way. I don't look down on people who don't give my book 5 stars. um, I know it's an observation. So I think that public historians still have a lot of really important, really difficult work to do if we're going to sort of take the field back from novelists and movie makers and TV people and journalists. No offense to journalists, I am a journalist, but most history as a general public reads tends to be written by journalists. So it was a balancing act, and it's one that I'm happy with, but I'm not sure if it's one that was necessarily successful yet, if that makes sense.
You may be ahead of your time. Readers may not have caught up to where you are in your thinking about the necessity for rigor balanced with these stories. I'm actually thinking as you're talking that I have an opportunity on this platform, on this podcast, to ensure that historical accuracy, or at least even historical facts, are disseminated to the public. And I'm thinking there may be some listeners or some viewers who don't even know about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And it would probably be helpful to give an overview of that, especially in light of a lot of denial of this type of history.
Right. At first, I want to speak to the first part of what you said, because as you know, I've been writing this blog for 14 years. It's in high school now. And, the responsibility we have as public historians is so, so real. And what makes it almost harder is that there's no one looking over us, advising us, and telling us, here's murders there, here's murders there. So we have to be constantly checking and double checking ourselves, because we're taking memory into our hands. And while it may seem like, oh, please, it's a blog, it's a podcast, it is a really big deal. People respect, I think, it when academics do try to talk to them and they take what we say seriously. So, I'm with you. Even if the rigor may not, they not might be ready for it in book form, we still don't really have a choice. It's our responsibility. Now, as for what the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is the most famous instance of Jewish resistance against the Nazis during the Holocaust. And I'd say in public memory, it's been very commodified by Hollywood on one hand and Israeli state building on the other. Um, and there aren't even enough movies about it for it to be totally Hollywoodified. But generally, what's been trickled down through public memory has been a version of the uprising where it's being fight by very young, brave, tragic men who are throwing Molotov cocktails, and sometimes there are women who are their girlfriends or mothers or whoever in the background. Um, that's even reflected in the art made about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. For those who have visited the site of the former Warsaw Ghetto, there is a monument there made by I just forgot his name. One moment. I'm just going to look that up. Nathaniel Rappaport. And on it, it portrays the ghetto fighters as almost biblical heroes, like strong, muscular, and masculine. And at the center of it is Mordechai Anielewicz, who was the main commander of the Jewish Fighting Organization, which was the underground group which planned and fought the uprising. And he was a hero. He should be in those monuments. That's not the issue. The issue is that there's only one female figure in that monument, and that's a breastfeeding mother who's sort of looking away from the viewer. And now there were breastfeeding mothers in the Warsaw Ghetto during the uprising, and their story is an important one to tell. But they were not the only women involved in the fighting and planning of the uprising itself. In fact, Sivia Lubetkin was the only female commander of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And right before it began, she was sitting with Mordechai Anielewicz and comforting him as he had a complete meltdown. And I don't blame him for having a meltdown and panicking. I would have panicked too. But she was there next to him doing emotional labor for him, cooking his meals, cleaning his clothing, doing gendered labor while being the only female commander, and she's nowhere to be seen in any of this art. Now, I briefly mentioned Israeli state building, and now that's a hornet's nest I really don't want to step on. But, post Eichmann trial, which is post 1961, a lot of their state building has been built around the idea of these beautiful, strong young people carrying out a brave last stand for the Zionist cause. And, these were very young, some of them were very beautiful young people, but they weren't fighting for Zionism or as Zionists. We had Zionists among them. We also had communist, socialist, Bundists, anti-Zionists. The Polish Jewish ideological spectrum between the two world wars was absolutely massive. So we had representations of all various schools of modern Jewish politics represented in that uprising. Moreover, I wouldn't argue that it was a tragic last stand because that's usually how it's understood. And I know why it's understood as such, because the Nazis put it down and burned the entire ghetto. But if you look at the writings of some of the fighters and the leaders, what they all make very clear is that they were not fighting with any desire to, or any pretensions towards defeating the Nazis or liberating Warsaw or ending the Holocaust. Their purpose in fighting was to restore the dignity of the Jewish people, to make a stand for history, to understand that there were Jews who fought back. There was no real, they were not people who just went silently and quickly and passively to the slaughter. And in that sense, they actually won because they forced the Germans to treat them as equals on the battlefield. On the first day of that uprising, the Jewish fire and Jewish resistance was so unexpected and so well organized that the Germans had to retreat and come back with backup troops and tanks and bigger, scarier guns. And in the end, they realized they couldn't actually defeat the Jews on their own turf, so they resorted to burning the ghetto. So, if the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was fought to force the Germans to acknowledge them as equals and humans on the battlefield, which some would argue that it was, you could argue that it succeeded. So that's also not understood. But again, there is this real cinematic Les Miserables-esque quality to these beautiful young people on the barricades with guns who die overnight. And that's certainly present. But that's not the entire story.
How do the stories of the women um, give us collectively, but certainly give the readers of the book a better understanding of what the resistance movement was about and what the actual events of the uprising um, were about and the eventual outcome?
So I did an interview earlier this week where we were talking a lot about resistance and its meanings and what resistance actually looks like. And in the eyes of the women in my book, resistance started long before there was a ghetto, or actually, yeah, before there was a ghetto, before there was genocide, before anyone knew what was to happen to them. And that resistance was interpersonal. It was refusing to allow the Nazis to isolate them. It was setting up covert courier networks so they could stay in touch with members of their political groups during the occupation. When the ghetto went up, they resisted by setting up underground high schools, covert libraries, cultural nights, concerts, game nights. And in their memoirs, Tsivia Lubetkin and Vladka Mead both wrote, well, actually, Tsivia wrote it, Vladka said it at a conference in the 80s, that there was real meaning and beauty to that day-to-day life, the day-to-day humanity that they had set up with their own cultural undergrounds in the ghetto, because they were in a situation where the Nazis were actively dehumanizing them. So they thought, okay, no, we're going to be humans. We're going to learn and laugh and read and dream that there will be a life after the war. Moreover, Sivia saw the sort of younger adolescents in the ghetto, seeing that the people who were growing wealthy inside the ghetto were underworld types, smugglers and pimps who were getting rich by black marketeering. And she saw that the 12 to 15-year-olds were looking up to those people and imitating them and just drinking and having a lot of very wild sex. And she thought to herself, I'm not going to let the Germans succeed at taking away these children's souls. So she was part of this movement to institute these underground educational institutes, because she wouldn't let the Nazis just corrupt the youth like that and create a situation in which the youth felt there was no existence outside of drinking and gambling and sex. Um, as for the women themselves, since the book came out, I've given a wide variety of talks, and some have called on me to do additional research into other underground movements. And what I found when we're looking at resistance that's not militarized, there are always women doing the quiet, necessary, uncelebrated labor, whether it be cooking or childcare or cleaning or doing the washing up or starting soup kitchens. Women are the builders of the backbones and the infrastructure of these resistance movements. One of my favorite examples is actually the Black Panthers Party. In the late 60s and early 70s, they began a free breakfast program for Black children. And the thinking was that they were preserving the humanity of their youngest and most vulnerable in a way that no one could really truly criticize, like what you're going to yell at them for serving kids breakfast. And it was the women who really were there doing the cooking and the serving. And it was very much the same with these women in Warsaw. Um, you know, uh, these young men and women in Warsaw were operating under very strong and distinct gender roles. I often say that I don't necessarily believe that the men were sexist, but they certainly did not question the gender roles they lived and were socialized under. So, whether it be organizing a course or a lecture night or a full day full of learning how to shoot, once that day's work was done, the men would sit down and talk, while the women would go and make dinner and do the washing up and do the laundry and do the cleaning, and no one questioned that. So, what I think is important for readers to understand about resistance is that it happens on the backs of the unspoken gendered labor. And without that gendered labor, there is no resistance. Now, the Jewish women in Warsaw did far more than just the washing up, obviously. They were also smuggling guns and riding on trains undercover and smuggling paper and documents and all of these incredible acts of bravery. But wherever there is organization that involves people and communities, it's the women who form the backbone.
One of my favorite stories from the book is um, the story about building a room that was sort of under the guise of remodeling a bathroom.
Mm,
And so
yes.
this room gets built, but the other part of the story, I mean, the logistics required for this. It was quite elaborate,
It was.
and but the part of that I smiled at and thought, wow, there was the parties that the women were having as sort of a cover so that meetings could occur and go undetected, and I think I think that illustrates the points you're making so well because these women were having these parties at great risk so that in this subterranean layer,
Mm,
other activities that may have been seen as the main activities, the real party is happening kind of under this
mhm.
guise of a loud party. But without the women having the loud party, these other activities would not have occurred.
And without those women having the courage to go out as Jews with only their own chutzpah and false documents to shield them and look in on those men and make sure those men had enough money for rent and medicine, that was huge. They'd be the ones organizing everything and waiting to hear and make sure that those men had gotten home safe. So yeah, they allowed those men to do the work that they did.
Mhm.
And yes,
How
I love those parties, especially the part where the women allowed their Polish neighbors to think that they were loose women having men over for parties when really those were resistance meetings.
Yes. How so you drew from a lot of different types of sources, from
Mhm.
diaries and testimonies and memoirs. Talk me through the process of kind of culling together these different data points and making sense of them. And I mean, every author, every researcher, every journalist selects information and then omits other information. And so, what was that like for you to say, this is important? And I'm curious about how you determined that.
So that process really happened over the course of the writing. Before we started recording, you and I were talking about having the sort of process of acquiring a literary agent. It took me 5 years between the idea for this book and the book signing the deal for me to get a literary agent. And very early on in the process, before I really knew what I was doing, I reached out to an agent. And while she didn't say, yes, I'll work with you, she was kind enough to take a minute and say, listen, you can't follow every single woman who was doing this book. You just can't. You need to choose four, maybe five, and stick to it. And I took that to heart. So I immediately had to start taking out individuals and stories that I loved. Um, you look at some of the old drafts of the book, there were originally huge amounts of information about the Treblinka death camp, about Jewish women and sexual assault during the Holocaust, about prostitution and teenagehood in the Warsaw Ghetto. But I was very strict with myself that I really, all of the context and all of the historical context had to serve the women and their stories. So I cut a lot of content that I actually really, really loved, including the story of one woman named Hella Schiffer, who was a Jewish resistance fighter and worker and courier. And there was an instance during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising where she escaped through a sewer, got separated from the main group, popped out of a what's the word, manhole a couple of blocks away, was caught by a German guard, then punched him and ran away. I had to cut that out, and it was so devastating because it would have added, another 50 pages of explanation about where she was and why she was there and why she was within their group. So I was like, this is an amazing story that I can't include. And I had to make a lot of those choices, and some my editorial team made for me. One of my very not final, but later drafts had about 10 pages about the Treblinka death camp. And eventually my editor and her assistant were like, Liz, this is great, but this story is not happening in Treblinka. Treblinka serves the story, not the other way around. So it was I really had to be very strict and disciplined with myself. But the amount of research I started out with was like 500, 600% more than what's actually included in the book.
And that is a nice aspect of doing podcasts or speaking at different events, because you are able to bring this research and these stories to the fore in a way that you were not able to include them in the book.
Absolutely.
I have a question about the trauma and the this is very heavy material. The
Mhm.
backdrop is horrific. Uh, this is a time of genocide, a time of um, degradation of the human soul. And it's difficult to read these stories. It's difficult to read memoirs. It's difficult to read letters, to see photos. Uh, and I'm curious how you address this with yourself as you were doing the research and the writing.
So I mentioned earlier how I sort of wouldn't allow myself to become a Holocaust historian until I was emotionally ready for it. And that was when I was 22 or 23 in my second semester of graduate school. And I'm not going to lie, those first couple of years were really, really rough. Studying this topic as a historian and really getting into the dark heart of it is incredibly difficult. And for, I want to say, the first year and a half, I was crying a lot. I was having nightmares. And well, there was one book that I actually didn't read until years after graduate school that really affected me that way. It's called Sexual Violence Against Jewish Women During the Holocaust, edited by Hedgepath and Seidel. And that book, I would not recommend that book to anyone who isn't a scholar of this field. That was probably the most difficult book I've ever read. However, over the years, I was able to grow what I call an emotional callus, a distance, a type of coping, so that I could read this material and not just fall apart. And so, writing this book, I was already at the point where I could deal with very heavy, very difficult material without falling apart. In fact, in some ways, I think I've almost grown too accustomed to it. Several of my friends have said to me, like, this is brilliant, Liz, but as a mother, I can't keep reading. I have to put it down. To which I say, yes, put it down. Go read something fun. Like, de-stress. Because I think, because this is my field and I live it, I don't, I no longer have the capacity to truly understand how heavy and traumatic some of this material really is, because it takes a lot to get me in a headspace where I can't cope. While writing this book, the most difficult primary source document I worked with, which put me in this headspace of I can't, I need to walk away, was a testimony written by a man who had spent 1 year as a prisoner, a slave in the Treblinka death camp. That was incredibly rough. So I'd say that, I cope with these histories because I've built up a tolerance.
Mhm.
Um, what I will say is that I'm definitely out of touch with how heavy or traumatic these stories and histories may be to the average reader, because I've gotten a lot of comments about how heavy and dark it is. And, in my historian brain, I'm like, and we often go to Auschwitz. What's the problem? But, I obviously do understand that it's rough. But you deal with that just by learning coping mechanisms, sometimes including bad ones, and moving forward and building up your tolerance.
I find that often the information itself, um, because there's so much information. I mean, I'm working in a different space around World War I, soldiers and Gold Star mothers, and and there are some similarities, although very different contexts. But
Very different
a
context, but
mother, a
yeah,
mother writing about the loss of a child is the same kind of the emotional output is the same. Um, and I find sometimes that just having more information helps me cope. Like, I just want to make more sense of it. I need more points that can create this meaning around whatever it is that I'm writing about. And I can imagine that that may be the case for a Holocaust historian, because there's a part of it that the simple question is, it how could this even happen?
hmm
How can we do this to other humans? How could this happen? And it's so unbelievable that more information, I don't know, it seems like more information grounds just being able to overcome the question itself. Well, it happened because it happened, and here is all the evidence for it.
right. Sorry, as you were talking, I was thinking about all the various things that could destroy you as a
Yeah.
historian of World War I. I mean, those nurses' testimonies and reading about those very, very young men and the injuries these very, very young nurses were dealing with. That is horrifying material.
It's horrifying, and then looking at the pilgrimages that occurred after the war, and what was written about those pilgrimages, ranging from the mothers that are visiting their sons' graves to the soldiers themselves, many of whom suffered, great injuries, and still traveled on a pilgrimage because they were just trying to make sense of what happened, and they were grieving the loss of their best friend who was buried in France.
That's very heavy stuff.
Yeah,
But, what you said, though, about wanting to learn more about it to make sense of it, that's also that serves an interesting function, because you're looking to make sense of it and you realize that this story happened a million times over. And you realize on some level there is no making sense of this. All we can do is
no.
try to look at what got us here.
Yes, that's true. And I draw a lot on the work of Viktor Frankl because my background is also in psychology. And I think that Frankl's work and being able to make meaning out of tragedy is he was so insightful. That really that is the only option, is to try and make some sense
Exactly.
in a way that we can move forward.
Exactly.
So your grandparents came
Great grandparents.
great grandparents came to the United States first, or
So
did
no,
what was their migration pathway?
right. So in 1939, September 1st, Germans start dropping bombs on Poland. My family was in Krakow, and my great grandfather said, "Okay, that's enough. We're gonna get in the car and drive away from those bombs. Let's go." And the family that got in the car are the ones that survived, with one exception. I'm sorry, the ones that got in the car were the ones who survived, and the ones who didn't were the ones who were killed, with just one exception. And so they just drove east away from the bombs until they reached the Lithuanian border. They hired smugglers to get them into Lithuania, which a lot of Jews did during various Holocaust era migrations. A lot of them did that also during their flight to Shanghai. And from there, they spent some time in Palestine. They lived in Tel Aviv for 2 years. However, in 1941, they learned that Mussolini was planning on bombing Palestine. So they left again. And through a very circuitous route, which involved an Ethiopian Italian ship, ended up entering the United States on a tourist visa via Canada in 1941.
Wow. And so you grew up with the stories
Yeah.
being passed down about how your family had left this situation, um, which is actually fascinating from a pilgrimage standpoint, because this is almost precisely uh, the type of context for
Mhm.
many people in any type of diaspora. They
Absolutely.
grow up hearing a story of the parents or grandparents or great grandparents, and there is a sense that, oh, you know, I need to go back to the place where my family came from. In fact, I was having a conversation with a colleague many years ago whose family had left Austria during the same time, and they came to the United States, first through Canada and then to the United States. And my colleague had just gotten, I think he was applying for Austrian citizenship. I think they have a diaspora birthright citizenship program. Anyway, he had gone back to Austria, and he said he was. They had a ceremony there. I don't know if it was a Jewish monument or something where the townspeople had come out for this ceremony. And he said he was standing amongst the townspeople at this particular monument, and the thought occurred to him, I'm actually Austrian. So for the first point in his life, he thought, had this all not happened, I would be Austrian. And it set in motion sort of a whole crisis for him, because he realized he'd grown up in the United States, and by passport, by nationality, he's American, but he felt at home standing in this area in Austria, and something overtook him to the point where he had this identity crisis
Wow.
that he's Austrian. And that's, I think, the case for so many people in a diaspora. It's not only about being Jewish, it's also about being Polish, in the case of your family. And so many people are now saying, wait, I want to go back to where my people came from because I'm Polish. And I'm curious if this is the case for members of your family, or if you're hearing this from people who are part of the Polish community or in the Polish diaspora or Jewish diaspora, that your book is really provoking this type of thinking for them.
You know, I've done some research on post World War II Poland and ongoing attitudes towards Jews, and I don't feel Polish. I don't feel kinship with that country. A lot of Polish people on the right wing still get really, really angry when it's discussed that many Poles were complicit in the Holocaust. Not all of them. They were victimized as well, and many of them risked everything to help Jews. But I don't feel Polish. If I were to leave the United States, which many academics are thinking about right now, the two easiest countries for me to move to would be Poland or Israel. But I don't really see any of those as my home. I'm a woman from Southern New York. That's sort of my identity. I'm not
Mhm,
sure where else I would make
mhm.
sense. Maybe Canada or Australia or New Zealand. Um, but I don't think I don't think Poles have grappled with the legacy of the Holocaust in the way maybe Germans and Austrians have. Um, so, I don't necessarily feel like if I went to Krakow and found my great grandparents' old home, I'd be home. Or if I went to Tel Aviv or found where my grandmother and her parents lived in those 2 years, I don't know if that would be home either. Um, it's a really interesting question, and I think a lot of it does depend on the relationship. The countries have grown towards the memory of the Holocaust in the years in between.
Yes, you're right, because who wants to become something where they're hated? I mean, that doesn't really compute. And I think it's informed by your family's experience. There's a lot of factors that inform that, but the family experience, I think, is particularly important. And I'm wondering about. So I've asked a question about, well, would you feel at home at Poland, or if you visited Poland, or if um, so many diaspora communities really want to get back to where they're from, and in this case, that's not really on the table for you.
And when you talk about Jews and diaspora, we're also talking about like diasporas from diasporas from diasporas from
Also,
diasporas.
yes, we're
So,
at yeah, at least tertiary diaspora here.
exactly,
Yeah.
the Sephardic diaspora went from the Netherlands to Britain, I'm sorry, Britain to the Netherlands to the Spanish New World to what's now the United States. So that's at least four diasporic journeys on top of the ones pre-existing the 15th century. So it's very multi-layered.
Yes. How has your own family history shaped your views of resistance, for example?
That's a fascinating question, and it makes me think of an anecdote. My mother told me about my grandmother and her parents' first days in this country. Um, you know, pre-war Poland, the Poles and the Jews, it was not a peaceful relationship. It was hostile, sometimes not hostile, but it was often hostile and violent. So, my grandmother and her parents had this idea of America is so free, it's the golden country. And so in 1941 or 1942, they took a road trip down to the American South. And the way they saw white Americans treating black individuals was so horrifying that not that like my grandmother never went below the Mason-Dixon line ever again. So we certainly have a strong and strand of fundamental ethical opposition to anti-black racism in my family.
I wonder if the book itself is an act of resistance, in the sense that there are a lot of people that deny that this, well, let's just be very broad. There's a lot of people that deny the Holocaust happened,
Yeah.
point blank. And if we come in even further, there are people who deny certain elements of the Holocaust, or there are people that deny that things were really that bad for the Jewish community in Poland, or more specifically in Warsaw. And I wonder if the book, I mean, it's literary resistance to this idea of erasure of history and of denial of history and actual events that occurred.
So about more than 10 years ago now, actually 15 years ago, no, 16, I don't even want to think about it. I was an intern at the September 11th Memorial Museum in New York City before it was fully open to the public. I was a collections management person, and I got to sit in on some really interesting curatorial meetings. And in one of them, they were talking about how to explain conspiracy theories within the museum. And I asked, why does that need its own exhibition space? Why should we pay attention to that? And my supervisor said, because those conspiracy theories are part of the story because they're a psychological response. So when I look at people doing denial or erasure or distortion of certain parts of the Holocaust, I think to myself, it's not on me to get through to them because they're still reacting with their emotions. They're still caught in an emotional cloud of cognitive dissonance that is not my role as a historian to pull them out of. I am not a deprogrammer. I'm not someone who is skilled in de radicalizing people. The best I can do is from a distance think, wow, they must be having a really hard time. And this temper tantrum is how they're expressing it. And I'll acknowledge it, but I will not engage with it. That's my response.
Mm-hmm. Fair. I think that's a solid response that keeps your boundaries intact. You profile so many interesting women and you've done research on so many more, as you've just highlighted. If you could sit down with one of the women,
Mm.
what would that look like? What tell me about who it is and what would you be curious about? What would you want to explore further?
So if I were to choose one of the women to sit down with, it would be Tosia Altman because I see kind of a kindred spirit in Tosia Altman. You know, she was incredibly brave. She was a community organizer from a very young age. She loved her people, but she wasn't always taken seriously by her peers in the underground. Some of them looked down on her because she joked around a little bit too much or was a little bit too silly and didn't perform, serious Zionist socialism the right way. And so she wasn't always respected, even when she was doing really incredible work. Some of her peers in higher levels of the Jewish resistance might be like, good work, Tasia, but like, why are you giggling? And I feel that at a very deep level. Because when I'm not being a serious academic, I like to be kind of a goofball and just be ridiculous and watch ridiculous TV shows and crappy pop music from the 90s and sometimes in academic circles I do sense that my peers are losing esteem for me because I don't perform serious academic the way they think I should. They'd be like, oh well, Foucault, and me and my bestie, who's now a tenure track professor at the Yale School of Medicine, will be over in her office just like giggling and making up words. So being in the position where your peers might look down on you because you're not performing your role well enough is something that I understand very intimately. So I figure we could just hang out on that level and like we would try to have a serious conversation, but then I feel like we would just start giggling about something and really go off topic. Um, as for the rest of them though, I wouldn't want to sit down with Sylvia Lubetkin, and not because I'm afraid of her, although I probably would be intimidated by her, but because Sylvia Lubetkin didn't want to be a symbol of anything after the war. She didn't want attention. At various points, the early iterations of the Israeli government really wanted to make her and her husband Yitzhak symbols of something, and she just wanted to be left alone. And, she had spent her life training to be a Zionist socialist, meaning she had spent her life training to live communally on a kibbutz in mandatory Palestine. And she did that. And she was really annoyed by people who kept wanting to talk to her about the war experiences. So I feel like I would respect her by not having lunch with her. Vladka, Vladka Mead dedicated her life to Holocaust education and commemoration. That was her life's work. But I would think I would be intimidated by her and maybe spend our entire lunch just like being in awe of her and not saying much. Tima Schneiderman, I could definitely hang with. I would definitely be intimidated by her. And Dr. Schweiger, man, Dr. Adina Blady Schweiger, I think it would be kind of like being with Vladka. I would just stare at her in awe until the lunch ended. But I don't have a favorite, but I definitely feel like I would have the most comfortable time with Tosia Altman.
What are you working on now? Tell me all about what you're doing now and what you're thinking of doing in the future.
So I'm actually working on a second book. I signed the contract for it last summer. And this book actually is about the Jewish community of Shanghai that I wrote my master's thesis about. So when you contacted me for this, I was like, if I was writing the Shanghai book was already out, we would have, so much more to
Well, you
chew
can
on.
come talk about the Shanghai book.
So I'm writing a book about the Shanghai refugee community, and it's sort of focusing on four girls who fled Germany, Austria, and Poland to Shanghai between 1938 and 1941 and came of age as stateless refugees in Shanghai. It's a really fascinating
It
story.
sounds fascinating. So you are continuing with amplifying the stories of young women, while also keeping the broad context of the Holocaust.
Mhm. Yes, and in some ways, I think of the Holocaust as hundreds of thousands of little events that eventually constitute this overwhelming whole. And so, while I don't necessarily think that the existence of this refugee community in Shanghai is the most important story out there, it's such an interesting piece of the whole. And it says so much about the global nature of these events, even when the actions taken against the Jews were very much sort of centralized in one area. Um, and there's many transnational applications, which I find fascinating because you have these traumatized Jews fleeing from Nazis right into the Sino-Japanese War and the Chinese Civil War, and lacking the context for the violence they see between Chinese soldiers and Chinese civilians. Did I say Japanese soldiers? I
No,
think I
you
did.
said Chinese.
Japanese soldiers
Yeah,
and
yeah,
Chinese
yeah.
civilians. And their reaction to that violence as people who don't know the context. It's just an incredibly fascinating set of stories and interactions.
What's your target publication date for that?
Well, the book is set to be released in 2028.
Hey.
Yeah.
I find the research is for me. I don't know if it's this way for you, but the research for me is so amazing. For me, it's hard to actually then pull it all together and write.
I
Do
know
you
what you
find
mean.
that, or
Oh,
are you
absolutely.
a person that loves to write also?
No, I love to write, but I feel like I'm always finding a new book or a new question I need to ask or something I need to explain more so that I have to like get 18 more books and it's the deadline is in 5 months. So I'm like, you need to stop researching, but I can't.
Yes,
But
I'm this. I absolutely love research rabbit holes,
yes,
and I
exactly.
mean, I think this is really where it's like the when one hole leads to another, and then you're so far be like past the main point, the main question. That's where really interesting stories are
Yes,
found that can then be brought back to this main question.
yes. What's made, the research process for the Shanghai book somewhat smoother is that I've already done a huge amount of research on it for my thesis. So most of the research now is sort of relearning the material and talking about it in a way that's fun, to
Yeah.
for lack of a better word. In my thesis, I was making an argument. When you're an academic and you're a historian and you're writing, you're always making an argument. In Girl Bandits, my argument was that these Jewish women's unique experiences coming of age in interwar Poland shaped them into the resistors they would be. And in my thesis, I made an argument about how nationality impacted how German and Austrian refugees reacted to Shanghai. But writing for the trade press, you don't have to make an argument. And so I'm kind of enjoying the freedom and being able to really delve into personalities and and intimate anecdotes without having to make an argument. Now, I will be making an argument because I don't know how to not make an argument because historians. Um, but I'm enjoying that doesn't have the fact that that doesn't have to be the central part of this book.
I'm curious about so many things, but I'll try to be brief here. I'm curious about how the research that you've done, well, for the first book or even now, what how is that impacting who you are?
I mean, it's made me into someone who's very weird at parties. That's my I was at a friend's wedding, we were all talking about what we do, and I was like, "Oh, I'm a writer, I'm a historian," and they were like, "What do you work on? What do you work on?" And finally I was like, "I work on the Holocaust," and I could just feel the mood shift. And everyone in the group was like, "Oh, yeah, yeah, my friend's grandma," and I'm like, "I'm really not trying to ruin the mood here."
I can see where that would be a showstopper.
But how it affects me as a person, it makes me just look at the world around me differently. Um, I think when you're a historian who looks at genocide and oppression and those types of histories, you know what the patterns look like, you know what the rhetoric looks like, you know what the political speech looks like, and it can make day-to-day living really scary and traumatic. Um, so sometimes it's made me into not a super fun person to be around because, you know, you can either be able to talk about the news like a calm, regular person, or you can just not engage much with the 24/7 news cycle and stick to your work and maybe come off as someone who's not informed. It's a delicate balance and certainly not one I've mastered. Um, I'd say in times when times are less politically uncertain, I think it's easier to navigate identities. Um, but when things are politically uncertain, as Curial term, it becomes much harder to put that historian identity aside because when one person just sees a normal conversation, you see violent genocidal rhetoric, and people who don't know what that looks like will tell you, calm down, like, don't freak out, you're being dramatic. And it's like, maybe I'm being dramatic, but I know what I'm hearing, and that's not fun. When historians see these parallels, what people need to understand is that we're not having a good time. You know, we're genuinely not having a good time listening to the news and being like, oh, she just threatened genocide on people who are legal citizens. Like, that's not fun. And, you know, no historian enjoys seeing that.
I I think I have one last question, but of course framed with a statement because academics.
Of
Um,
course.
you've spent so much time, effort, probably a lot of sleepless nights, a lot of disappointments, a lot of joyous occasions with the goal of amplifying the voices and the stories and the experiences of women. Pretend that it's 100 years from now and there's a young woman who discovers you. What would you want her to know about you? How do you want to be remembered?
I'm going to answer this question in a roundabout way. So I'm childless by choice. I'm technically what's called child free. And sometimes people say to me, but, you know, who's going to remember you? What's your legacy? And I think my legacy is the books that I write. And I don't know if they'll be out of print by then or if people will still be looking at this. But for me, this work is the legacy I'm leaving behind. I'm not sure what I'd want to tell that young woman other than, "I'm so glad you're reading this." But that's sort of how I envision it. These books, I'm not writing them to cement a legacy for myself, but if I were to think about what will be left of me when I peace out, it will be these books, I think. And please excuse my use of peace. One thing I really am hoping for, not just for financial reasons, is that at some point this work is optioned for a movie or a mini series on like HBO, because I talked earlier about how memory is shaped much more by movies and TV and novels than it is by the work you and I do. So if, you know, some Hollywood type ever came across this book and thought, huh, I'd be really, really excited because that would be another avenue through which to inject these women's memories back into the mainstream. But also, yes, it would be financially nice, but that's sort of secondary to the purposes here.
Then I feel like we'd have to have a conversation about who's playing which person. This is where all your interests are going to intersect.
I've already cast Timothée Chalamet as Yitzhak Zuckerman and Idina Menzel as Sylvia Lubetkin circa 1961. So,
Nice. Okay. So there's some potential. Maybe someone looking at this, listening or viewing it, will catch the baton there.
and be like,
Thank
okay,
Yeah, yeah. Well, it why not? It's these are amazing stories
they are. They really,
that
really are.
really need to come alive on the screen. I mean, we can read
It's
about
so
them.
cinematic. I mean, who doesn't want to watch
Yes,
a bunch of like young, brave I mean, this is very crass, but good-looking young women jumping off of walls while holding dynamite. I mean, that's good stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Who wouldn't get on board with that?
I know. Think of the soundtrack.
I
Actually, in my head, the soundtrack is Muse and Les Mis, so I wouldn't be in charge of
I knew
that.
you would have the soundtrack
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
kind of as the background. I really appreciate you taking the time to
Well, of
speak with
course.
me about your book and about your new book and about the research in your family history and even some of my pilgrimage musings, because that's what I talk about. It's been absolutely fantastic to meet you in
Thank
person,
you.
on a screen
Appreciate it.
and to hear about your work.
Yes. Oh, and there is one more thing I wanted to interject
Please do.
when we were talking earlier about how we hand down these stories from generation to generation and diasporas. And one thing that I think is unique about Holocaust survivors and their children and their grandchildren is that they all follow a very specific pattern. Survivors didn't talk about the Holocaust with their baby boomer generation children. They did not. They didn't talk about it, didn't acknowledge it when it came up. They would sort of dissociate and give not a lot of answers. But they opened up in a very real way to their millennial grandchildren. When my grandmother talked to me about her experiences, she told me about things that my mother, who's the keeper of the family lore, had never heard her grandmother, sorry, her mother, my grandmother, talk about in her entire life. And this is a documented pattern with Holocaust survivors and their families. And I think that's a really, really fascinating one. So I just wanted to toss that in there.
Yeah, it's important. It's a trauma response. It's also the same with many combat veterans who don't necessarily speak to their children, but they'll talk to their grandchildren about these experiences. And I think it's a unique honor to be a grandchild and hear from the grandparents
It is.
about what was too scary or sacred, or they wanted to protect their kids, so that's
Of
also why they
course.
didn't share. But
And they wanted to put it behind them and escape.
yeah, yeah, yeah. There's a lot to be learned about collective trauma through the families where there are survivors who are now interacting or have interacted with their
Yeah.
grandchildren or even great grandchildren.
And I think there's a lot of interesting work being done on that right now. The time to look through it all, but there's some really exciting psychological writings about second and third generation